Hello class, today we are looking at the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and we're looking at that by way of points made by Robert Wicks in his essay titled Death and Enlightenment, the Therapeutic Psychology of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, by Robert Wicks. And this is within an anthology from 1999 titled Death and Philosophy edited by Malpass and Solomon. And so Wicks obviously is a psychologist and not a philosopher, but yet we are seeing that there's a confluence between the two disciplines, and he is alive today, teaching out of Loyola University, and also the author of plenty of books on facing the challenges of life by way of therapy and Eastern philosophy. So then this essay represents the coherence of psychology and philosophy, or the confluence of psychology and philosophy, and also religious practice, and then obviously death. And so now we must also acknowledge that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, otherwise known as the Bardo Thodo, is a Tibetan Buddhist text written back in the Middle Ages by Karma Lingpa, who was born in 1326 and passes away in 1386, so really medieval Tibet. And the Bardo Thodo, the title of the Book of the Dead, Bardo Thodo, translates into liberation through hearing during the intermediate state. And so we also need to recognize that psychology and philosophy are not wholly the same, so we need to see that there is a difference, whereby philosophy has to do with the ways in which we study nature, truth, existence, et cetera, whereby with psychology, this has to do with the way in which we're approaching the scientific study of the mind, behavior, and mind functioning. And so we also need to see that something that is therapeutic is also serving as a way to heal in terms of a process of healing. So drawing about a process of healing can then be thought of as so-called therapy. So Wicks highlights that if we're thinking about life as a succession of moments, we could also see death as a final moment in life. And we also might see moments as dying, and each moment is also born into the future. So this idea of moments then is important. And then there's also another way to consider death, as Wick puts it, whereby, quote, our habitual patterns of expectation and reaction to circumstances often produces a death-like stagnation while we're alive, in terms of unanimated redundancy with our experiences, unquote, in our lives. So in other words, even if we're not dying, while we're living, we could be in a so-called death-like state due to inactivity, unanimated redundancy, stagnation, so on and so forth. So for Wicks, the Bardo Thodo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, represents a way of therapeutic release and liberation for the living and the dead alike. So the Bardo Thodo is not just a book, it's representative of the Tibetan Buddhist funerary tradition, whereas as soon as someone dies, a Buddhist monk is assigned to read the text aloud in a room accompanied by the person who is dying, by his friends and family. So, in other words, the person is read the person who has died or is dying is read the Tibetan Book of the Dead and accompanied by his mourning friends and family, his grieving friends and family. So the reading of the text is intended to be heard by the deceased and by the deceased's spirit, who is in an after-death realm known as a bardo, or a transitional state. So the word bardo is defined as an intermediary transitional state between reincarnations. And so the dead person's soul is in this bardo state, or is in this bardo. So the reading of the text aloud is a way to aid and guide the deceased's spirit as a way to guide the spirit into an opportunity for enlightenment, so as to keep the spirit from reincarnating into another life of suffering, a renewed state of suffering. So I think just a minute ago I mentioned that the person could be dying, but here it's clear that the person is already dead. Once the person is already dead, a monk is assigned to read the Bardo Thodol to the deceased person in their home, accompanied by grieving friends and relatives. So the soul of the dead person is in a decision-making phase, there to choose between liberation in terms of their transformation of the soul. And then this is to be thought of as a liberation from so-called unconscious tendencies that bring about suffering, or to choose a life bound to hungers and drives that kept them deluded and unenlightened. So essentially the Bardo Thodol is representative, a representation as a guide for the soul immediately after death. So this is also a way to guide the soul to the rebirth into a new physical body, being that the Tibetans believed, Buddhists, the Tibetan Buddhists believe in reincarnation. And so the key is always to get to help the deceased as soon as possible after death. And this is why it is said, this is where it is said to be the optimal time, because there is clarity right as soon as the person dies, because this clarity is doesn't last longer. So in other words, it fades the longer you wait. And so there's also a risk of the soul, if unguided, will fall into hellish bewilderment and selfishness and animal aggression, okay? And so for the living, this is an obvious message that if you don't change your ways in life, you're also doomed to fatefully repeat suffering and pain, and now and in subsequent existences. So in other words, even though the monk is reading to the dead person, the friends and relatives that are grieving are also hearing this, and their hearing of it is also a way in which they could start considering how to reform and become better people in order to ensure an enlightened way to live, and also so that when they die, they have better chances of retaining enlightenment. So also in the reverse, if you lead a life of incessant hunger and violence and problems with anger and selfishness, your Bardo state will be reflected as such, right? And so also there's the implication that no one is perfect and no one is in a perfectly enlightened state in life, and likewise upon death. And so we all need to do the work of overcoming desire, envy, jealousy, aggression, hunger, anger, so on and so forth. And so as indicated in the Bardo Thodol, there are Tibetan gods and demons that the soul confronts that serve as challenges and reminders to those enlightened and hellish states. So these are really just reflections of the soul's own personality and basic psychic tendencies. So there's strong emphasis on the notion that the gods and demons are psychological projections of one's soul, and that these are here to remind one to detach from their ego-centered personality toward enlightenment. So one is to see these projections as illusory guides, with a strong implication that enlightenment is a drawing away of the ego-centric self-conception. And so we need to see that the selfishness, envy, hunger, jealousy, aggression, animality are illusory states that pull us, and so we are wishing to pull away from these tendencies in our enlightenment to then ensure better life for our soul, so on and so forth. So Wick also emphasizes a point that we made earlier, that the Bardo Thodol is only, that the reading the Bardo Thodol is only designed to aid the deceased, but it's also a therapeutic service for the living who also occupy these egoistic, unenlightened ways, to be then living in a so-called death-like state. So in other words, in life, you could also be in a death-like way and then need to have the reminder to become enlightened and draw away from these lower life tendencies. So as mentioned, the illusory nature of the deities and demons is emphasized in the Tibetan Book of the Dead as personally related to the souls of the living. So these are known as the yidams, or these are known as yidams, or manifestations of the person's psychological states. So likewise, the soul is not looking for favors or punishments by the yidams in particular. And so the fate of one's soul is our personal responsibility. So the decision to become enlightened is in our hands, and it is in the hands of our soul. And so there is a strong sense, as implied in the Bardo Thodol, that these gods and demons are real, similar to the way dreams are real, yet they hold no actual reality for us. So yet we need to be careful here to show that even as the yidams are to be considered illusory, there still is a sense that these illusory powers are representative of the very real tendencies that hold on to us and grip us into and persuade us into these delusions and illusions that we have in life. I.e., when we are deluded, these delusions are ways that we are seeking to control our problems or not. In other words, the delusions have real power over us, or our delusions are ways that we become deluded in life to the degree that we stray from our enlightenment. So suffering is real, and the problems we have are real. We just need to see that more often than not, that which brings about our suffering has illusory qualities, as with the yidam. So in other words, the suffering that we endure could also be part of our delusion as well in life and likewise in death. And so interestingly enough, the Bardo Thodol is neutral with regard to the actual and literal reality of the Bardo states experienced by the deceased soul, or these, or if these Bardo states are powerfully symbolic, we see that these descriptions are merely symbolic, and there's also relevance for those who don't believe in the afterlife of the soul. In other words, are we seeing the therapeutic elements of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as only helpful for the actual soul of the dead, or are we seeing therapeutic value also in terms of our death-like states while we're alive? Okay, so in other words, there's an indication that an existence of after-death-like states of consciousness are not always the strong implication of the guidance offered. So in other words, there is indication that an existence of after-death states of consciousness are not always the way in which we're thinking of the value of the guidance. In other words, we also want to focus on these points while we're alive. So in the Bardo Thodol, we need to acknowledge that immediately after death, consciousness is at its purest revelation to us, and this is what is characterized as the grounding for all experience. And so consciousness is linked to a luminous emptiness or shapeless void. Then our consciousness is taken to a bardo state whereby we face karmatic obscurity. And so there's a relation to a more specific points of our egoistic selves that are projected onto a surface of water in the forms of various demons and deities that are emblematic of ourselves as we lead our lives in our everyday state, for which we're to ask, is it important that we have these after-death states of consciousness at all? And so if there is one, it is identically representative of the nature of reality. And so Wick has a hard time discerning how an after-death consciousness is to be reconciled with this void state in relation to ultimate reality. And so there's the implication that it's not clear in the text of the Bardo Thodol. And so, in other words, there's a problem grappling with this in terms of the universality of the claims, with the notion that, for example, as we're considering the Tibetan Book of the Dead right now in relation to deities and demons that we might face as soon as we die. In other words, will we be facing those demons and deities? And so, in other words, will we then become unified with the whole of reality when we're dying here, say, in the United States? So, in other words, is this a problem? Really, it seems improbable. So with Wick, he admits that there's still therapeutic value in the recitation of the text for the living with regard to Siddhartha Buddha's teaching that we have misery and in our lives, and that's a factor in our lives, and that we seek to cease having this misery, and that's part of our goal toward enlightenment while we're alive. In other words, while we're alive. And so human existence is full of suffering. And so here we see a message as a way to contend with and to aid our suffering in terms of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so in terms of the therapeutic value for the practitioner, even if you're not believing in deities and demons. And so Wicks concludes that the Book of the Dead is intended for the dead of this world and those that have become deadened by the desire, jealousy, and envy that envelops their lives, or that they allow themselves to become enveloped by. And of course, the manifest suffering that we are all enduring through our lives. So these points are helpful for the dead, and most importantly, for the living who take part in the receiving of this wisdom by way of funerary rites offered in the household of the deceased family, and friends, and loved ones who are grieving. And so Wicks also touches on the problem of interpretation with the Tibetan Book of the Dead by way of the great Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, born in 1875, dies in 1961, and also the German, German Buddhist Lama Govinda, or Anagarika Govinda, who was born in 1898 and passes away in 1985. So both of who wrote commentaries on the Bardo Thodol. Yet in the case of Jung, Wick feels that there's not enough emphasis on the living aspects of the text for Jung, and with Lama Govinda, his reading is exclusionary and too aristocratic. And so in conclusion, for Wicks, Western understanding of the Tibetan Book of the Dead as souls who are in need of guidance by way of funerary rites, so on and so forth, we can all have benefit, right? Whether we are believing in the gods and demons or not. And so we all need help becoming enlightened, and we have to acknowledge that the lifetime of the Tibetan, that we have to acknowledge that in the lifetime of a Tibetan Buddhist, and of course monks and devotees, the recitation of the Book of the Dead would just be a one-time occurrence, and there could be multiple times that they are exposed to the text, depending on how many people have passed away in their lives. In other words, due to the fact that they attend different funeral rites for other families, other family members and friends. And so add to this that there's an indication that there's always enlightenment for us, but the enlightenment is up to us, right? And so we are responsible for our own soul and our own desires, our own pleasures, our fears and enlightenment. And so such rebirth is not guaranteed, and it's up to us and our souls to do the work to become enlightened and to consciously direct ourselves toward it. And I think also throughout the text, I may have been referring to either Wick or Wicks, but we should be referring to Wicks throughout. So I'll be sure to note that in the class notes as well. I think from time to time I was referring to Wick as opposed to Wicks. So thank you, and we'll talk more later, and